I saw a generation that is in profound distress.
1 out of 4 young Americans identify as a different gender.
They were treating every child as emotionally damaged. They'll say anything from climate change, police tactics, being born Black. We've convinced an entire generation they're mentally ill.
It is so important what you just said.
Step number 1 shouldn't be therapy and medication. Some kids will need it. The problem is we are creating mental disorder.
Abigail Shrier, anybody that doesn't know who you are is probably living under a rock, so I'm not sure we need to give an introduction. You have been one of the most important figures, I would say, in America and the West over the last few years, because you have reported on discoveries of things that are so significant to young American families. So I can't wait to have an in-depth discussion about your books and everything that you have been doing. Can you share a little bit about your work?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. And the last book I wrote, my first book, was called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And it was about the social contagion of the trans epidemic. Teenage girls suddenly deciding with their girlfriends that they were transgender, they were really boys, and pushing for hormones and surgeries and getting them. And when I wrote the book, it came out in 2020. It was the first book to sort of name this phenomenon and explain the risks and what was happening. And it really shocked a lot of people who I think didn't know it was certainly a nationwide phenomenon. It turned out to be an entirely Western phenomenon. So the book's been translated into 10 languages because America has actually exported the transgender epidemic among teen girls throughout the West.
When you came out with this book, I remember we called you up, we did a 5-minute video, and I remember people saying to me, this issue is so fringe. Okay, it's not even possible that so many young girls or even boys would really be in danger. And we got a lot of pushback against it. And I remember that you also went on Joe Rogan, and I was actually wondering whether Joe Rogan would ever allow you to go back because that episode got censored, but he stood by you.
He did.
And that was really amazing. Did you experience a similar kind of pushback that when you released the second book?
So no, my second book, of course, is Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. And it's about all the ways the mental health industry has actually hurt the mental health of the rising generation. And I think that I was very early with the first book, so people didn't realize, and they really wanted to stamp out my counter narrative. When I wrote the book in 2020, there was no mainstream book that had shown the risks of the harms and that it was a social contagion for these girls. So it was a real threat to the prevailing narrative, and the left had really done nothing but made cultural gains for basically unimpeded for 7 years or so. So with this book, I think people have actually already started to notice, wait a second, why does every teenager I know say they have anxiety? Why does every kid who talks about, having a bad experience in middle school describe it as PTSD? Where did they get the idea? And why are so many of them on psych meds? Why are they on several psych meds at once? So they have this sense that the kids are swimming in therapy. And so what I did was I tried to bring out the psychological research to show not only are they swimming in therapy, they're swimming in what we know to be bad therapy.
The gender affirming care, I don't even know what to call it, phenomena, evil, is so massive. I want to focus on it further because my question is, when you came out with this book, were there already a lot of girls and boys that were transitioning and simply we didn't know that much about it? There was just poor journalism and poor reporting? Or have we been seeing a surge of additional young girls and boys because it's so culturally dominant right now in our schools and TikTok, and there are actually more girls and boys that are transitioning? I read somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, that 1 out of 4 young Americans identify as a different gender right now, where it may not be transgender, but bi or mixed or something like that. So is there an actual growth in the number of kids that are identifying as trans, or was it just underreported in the past?
So the reason I wrote the book was because I already knew it was a much bigger phenomenon that had been reported. I don't write about things people already know. So you'll see in my new book, I don't use the word woke. I'm not here to make people feel comfortable in what they have already heard about. As a journalist, I try to uncover stuff that parents might not know. And with the last book, the reason I knew it was a major phenomenon was because a number of parents brought it to me. I did some research, and then I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about it. And they got nearly 1,000 comments from parents saying, yes, 20% of my girl's 7th grade is identifying as trans. And then something interesting happens. The New York Times was very upset with me, and their transgender columnist posted a response to my article, and her article got almost 1,000 comments, and most of them were backing me up. So then I knew I had a much bigger phenomenon to work with, and there were a lot of parents, eager to tell me their story. So that, yes, I think it was both an underreported phenomenon. Nobody wanted to touch the topic. No. I tried to give it to another reporter. Nobody wanted to touch it.
Because many are talking about now. People are talking about. And so do I say thank you? Thank you, right? This is amazing. So the new issue that you've taken on is something that I relate to very much. And that is this issue that everybody needs therapy, right? And that everybody is mentally broken. And the only way they can be fixed is by going to therapists and possibly taking pills and really festering, is that the word, over this issue of their mental space. So what led you to write this book? Did you see something in the way that you saw something with the transgender girls?
I did. I saw a generation that is in profound distress. We know that less than half of the rising generation, so-called Gen Z, believes that its mental health is good. But that's surprising because they've also gotten the most wellness tips, the most anti-bullying tips, the most emotional regulation in schools. They've had social emotional learning now for 15 years. They should be the picture of mental health. But when I wrote my book proposal, I still didn't think it was because of therapy, because after all, only less than half of the kids, about 40%, still the most, have been in therapy. But it still wasn't even half. But then I wrote the book with a different thesis originally. I pitched it to a publisher and sold it. And the thesis was it had something to do with the way they were being raised. Maybe they were being raised differently. And then I attended a 3-day conference put on by the public school system in California devoted to mental health. And I thought, well, gosh, I want to find out what the schools are doing for mental health. And what I learned there was that it wasn't just the kids who were on the couch, that therapy, or what I call bad therapy, had gone airborne. And in fact, the largest patient pool in the country was in public schools.
How? What did you see that led you to realize that?
I saw that the mandate of schools was now trauma-informed care. These are people who believe that every child is traumatized, that their bodies are holding on to intergenerational trauma. By the way, a lot of this is nonsense, as I write about in the book. But they were teaching kids this. They were treating every child as emotionally damaged. And not only was there no discipline anymore, but the whole program was one of social emotional learning, which was a kind of group therapy. And instead of ever punishing, the kids were always for bad behavior. They were sent to the counselor now. And what does the counselor do? The counselor gets you out of requirements. They help you avoid hard things in school, like timed tests. That is their big lever that they use. Now, let me just say, I'm not against therapy. I'm not even against psych meds. And even for kids, sometimes they need them, okay? There are kids in profound distress who are profoundly suffering. But that's not how these things were given out. They were given out across the board. Many of the recommendations, by the way, for ADHD medications come from the teacher now. And these are stimulants. These are really powerful stimulants. So the school was very much working as sort of a mental health ward in our country.
It's like SCL is like a feeder into the mental health industry.
Right. That's right. And they were doing the most, as I learned while writing this book. And I should say, I didn't know when I started any of this, but I interviewed a lot of academic researchers in the field of psychology. And what I learned is a few things. One, getting kids to focus on their emotions and think about their emotions all the time and track their emotions is the way to make them dysregulated. It's also the way to make them unhappy. ruminating on a painful experience. That's what they're asking kids to do in public school. Tell us about a time when you were in pain. Think about a time when you were rejected. Think about a time when you failed. How did that make you feel? That is the number one symptom of depression. It's ruminating on a past pain, not letting it go, and rehearsing it over and over. And that's what we were inducing in school children.
I just go back to my years of getting my master's in education. And I remember being encouraged as a teacher, whether it's through social emotional learning, SEL. Now I think of it as the Trojan horse. But I remember being given the mandate to actually sit with my students and have everybody share their emotions and create a safe space for everyone so that we can unite together. And so you're saying that something struck you when you were attending these conferences and you said, this doesn't make sense. Why are we doing group therapy with a teacher who's clearly not equipped to do any therapy, let alone therapy in front of 40 other kids?
That's right. I mean, one of the things I learned by talking to these researchers in the field of psychology was that it sounds innocuous. Ask a bunch of kids, how are they feeling?
Yeah.
Well, what could be wrong with that, right? They could say, I'm feeling great. The problem is their mandate is teaching social emotional learning, teaching emotional regulation. Well, if you say, great, I feel great, there's nothing to teach. So it always heads in the direction, now think of a time when you were in pain. Now think of a time when you felt bullied, when you felt left out. And then there's a second part. So that in itself increases dysregulation. By the way, it makes it harder for kids to achieve any tasks. We know this. Focusing on yourself makes it harder to achieve any hard task at all.
I totally relate to this because I think that when I'm in a bad place, if I'm constantly thinking about poor me, poor me, poor me, what is the hardest thing I've gone through recently, right? I actually become weaker and less efficient.
Right.
I can't even focus, right? Because I'm just focusing
Right.
on how hard things are. And I'm an adult, right? So I can possibly better regulate myself.
Right.
But for a child to just take them down this direction of like, poor me, what is the worst thing I could think about right now? And then, okay, now let's go to math class.
Right, exactly. And here's the thing I want parents to know. It's different with adults. So as bad as that is for adults, it's worse with kids. And here's why. Because you're sitting around with your school counselor or teacher talking about your trauma. So now you've told a whole group of kids they've been traumatized.
Is that word trauma, by the way, used in school? The teachers are using this term trauma.
Their mandate is trauma-informed care. We need to accept that most kids have been traumatized. That's what they say.
Traumatized by what?
Well, they'll say, they list, it's based on a study, but it's a study that's been terribly abused. So they exaggerate the causes, but they'll say anything from climate change can cause trauma to police tactics can cause trauma. Being born Black can cause trauma. I talked to a wonderful teacher in public schools who was Black, and she finds it extraordinarily offensive that kids are told being born Black in America means you've been traumatized and you have an inherited trauma. But the thing I want parents to know is if kids are sitting around and doing this with their counselor or teacher, well, who was supposed to keep them safe from trauma? The parents. So very naturally, it always leads to a criticism, or very naturally, it will lead to a criticism of the family, of the parents. Because, of course, the next question is, where was your mom? Where was your dad when this was happening? Oh, she didn't have time to help me.
Abigail, why do you think the system is doing this? Is it just a thing that is snowballing out of control because people are just losing right for wrong, the ability to discern what's the right thing to do for children? Or is there a nefarious industry that is trying to break the family, over-medicate children, empower the government? What's your hunch on that?
It's a great question. It's an important question. Is this on purpose? Is this people acting together? Here's what I'll say. As a journalist, I try not to speculate on things that I don't have proof of. And here's what I have proof of. If you wanted to break kids down emotionally, if you wanted to break them down, there would be no better program than the program now in schools that goes under the headline mental health.
It almost doesn't matter really who is orchestrating it. What matters is that we have to save our kids.
Right.
So part of me wants to say, that's it. I'm never going to send my children or any child I love to a mental health clinic or to a therapist because now they're potentially going to be in danger. And then part of me says, okay, well, we have to live in the real world, right? And as parents, we're afraid. We're afraid to not serve them in the best way possible. We're afraid that if they're dealing with anxiety or serious mental health issues, if we don't provide them with an expert to help them, then are they going to be broken? Are they going to commit suicide? Right? It's very, very scary to raise our children alone and then say no to all the experts and then see a child suffering and hear that the experts are saying, well, here's a solution, and say, no, I don't want this solution. And so how do we navigate through that? How do we find a balance between figuring out when to send a child to the therapist and when to say this is completely unnecessary? Is there a line that you have realized that we can draw?
Yes, and it's easy. Does your child have a serious problem that you can't otherwise fix by changing their environment, by making changes in that environment? Okay. If you cannot stabilize your child, if they have a problem, anorexia, obsessive compulsive disorder, they can't get out of bed, they're so depressed. There are so many problems that face kids today. Now, look, if you can make changes in their environment and it helps, by all means, start there. But if you can't stabilize them, then you may need to take them to a therapist, and then you need to research the therapist like you would any surgeon.
Would you send your child to sit with a therapist without you in the room?
It's a good question. It depends what the problem is. But here's what I want to say. I want to reset the default settings.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I'm not here to tell people what to do with their kids. But here's what I know. Step number 1 shouldn't be therapy and medication.
Yeah.
Because therapy is not a neutral act. Giving a kid a diagnosis, telling them they have a brain problem, which is what that does, that can change a child's self-concept. It can limit what they think they can do on their own. Now, I'm not saying there's a time and place for that. Some kids will need it, and they should get it. The problem is we are over-treating every child. We are taking every child and treating them as disordered. Mm-hmm. And so we are creating mental disorder.
So I have this crazy theory. I call it kiss your calluses. And one of my friends says nobody emerges from hell empty-handed. That's her way of phrasing it. But the point that I make is I actually think that hardship is good for you.
Absolutely.
I think that some of the most impressive people that I know have gone through hard times. And it's possible that our kids have not gone through such hard times. And when they go through something not even that hard, they're told that they're victims of their environment.
So there are certain kinds of adversity that is no doubt really good for kids, but here's the most important part of it. We need to tell them the truth, and this is the truth. Resilience is the story of the human condition. Most kids, even who go through really hard things, even different forms of abuse, most kids will emerge resilient. They will recover. And we have to assume for most of them that will be the case. Now, of course, you give help to the kid who is really suffering. There's no question. But they need to be told the truth, that their grandparents went through hard things, that their great-grandparents went through hard things. It's the only proof they have that they can get through hard things too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then meanwhile, we're kind of erasing history and not even bothering to teach history.
Right.
We mostly teach victimhood.
And we don't even teach them their own history. See, we need to connect them to their grandparents, to their cousins. We need to tell them what the family went through. So when they hear you have inherited trauma, they'll say, no, I don't. You know what I have? I have the toughest grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents around. Because they will face adversity in their lives. There's no getting around that. We need to tell them you can get through it too. Because the vast majority of them will.
Yeah, it's incredible as you describe this. I think about my mother-in-law who her mother barely escaped concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And she went and hid. And my mother-in-law was actually raised in a displaced person camp. And she today is one of the happiest people I've ever met. I mean, just everything makes her happy. Like a chocolate bar makes her happy. It's that perspective of, I can't think of a worse childhood than what Holocaust survivors had gone through. But it's pretty amazing how we have these generations of people who've survived the Great Depression. And they had this ability to discern. They have this ability to find happiness. And they were just mentally so strong.
That's right.
And then we look at today's young generation, and so many of them are depressed And so many of them are committing suicide and they're on medication. It's actually when I read your book and I think about what you talk about, it's actually pretty alarming and obvious at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just think about if your mother-in-law had gone through school today. So she would have been told by a school counselor, oh, wow, that you have gone through serious trauma. We need to meet regularly and talk about it because you will not, this is not something we can just get beyond unless we talk about it. Okay. Your mother would have had an entirely different trajectory.
Yeah.
But nobody meddled with her in that way because actually humanity, we have incredible resources. These kids are treated, their feelings are always front and center. Parents do this too. They apply the therapeutic methods to kids and they tell them their feelings are the most important thing in the world. How are you feeling today? How are you feeling now? So these kids are being crushed under the weight of their own feelings and they're being tyrannized by the weight of each other's.
I see that actually also in hiring. So I speak to different entrepreneurship groups, and obviously we have 150 employees here. Every single person that works for PragerU is absolutely perfect, and there's no issues whatsoever with them, ever. But let me just say that oftentimes when I interview, I come across employees as CEO. The word trauma PTSD is used on a regular basis for things that are just simply somewhat lightly challenging, right? It's like I'll give somebody a task that's too hard for them and they'll say, oh my gosh, it's traumatizing.
That's right.
Or a long day at work is traumatizing. Is going to or even if they're reprimanded by HR or their supervisor, they're going to have PTSD from being told that their work is not good enough, right? It is this stuff that starts at childhood, from my perspective as an employer, is seeping into the human capital workforce of America and possibly the West.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And let me tell you, there's a brand new piece of research that came out that showed that adults who were believed they were traumatized as children are more likely to have adult psychopathology. They're more likely to be, have physical, mental health problems than adults who went through the same things as children, whether it's abuse, neglect, whatever it is. If they don't believe they were traumatized as children, they're less likely to have adult psychopathology. They do better.
Wow.
Because being told and believing you went through trauma is debilitating.
I know that the majority of your focus is on children and what is happening within, the mental health. It's an industry. Right? Yeah. It's an industry. It's obviously a money-making industry as well. But the industry actually progresses into the HR industry in businesses across America, right? You have an HR industry that is constantly worried about traumatizing employees as well. How dare we say something that is going to make them slightly uncomfortable, right? And we have just weakened the entire American spirit rather than telling everybody, you know what? If somebody actually pushes you up the ladder, that means they believe in you. Right. That means they think that you can even do more. That means that they don't think that you need to be a victim. So imagine recentering the entire thing around this perseverance, this concept of perseverance. And if we started that at kindergarten, what kind of workforce we would see in America right now, what kind of military we would see in America, what kind of leadership we would see in America, right? I imagine anybody that listens to this, whether they have children, employees, or friends in their lives, none of us want people walking around feeling offended and traumatized all the time.
Right. And that's why they're not showing up for work. They're demanding mental health days off of work, right? They don't feel up to the challenge of adulthood. That's a huge problem. They've been debilitated by the lie we've given them that they all have a mental health condition, and it's limiting them. I want people to know that. I'm not, there are people who have mental health struggles, but unfortunately, we've convinced an entire generation that they're mentally ill or mentally weak, and it makes them weak. And we need to give them the opposite message. And here's the best news for parents. It's so easy, and it doesn't cost anything, okay? Kids need authority. We know this. This is really good psychological research. They need authority in the home. They need community, people they love and love them back, like extended family. Mm-hmm. Really love them, not the expert mom hired to watch you, the ones who really love you. Even grandma who gives them the wrong foods. That's really important. They need to hear what their own families went through. And this is going to be the hardest part for parents. They need independence. with actual important and sometimes dangerous things, like walking home from school by themselves, using knives. We have to give them skills and trust them to use them. Now, I'm not talking about social media. We didn't evolve to handle social media. We didn't evolve so that strangers could prey on our children on social media. That's not something we evolved to handle. But navigating your neighborhood by yourself, being trusted to, walk home from school, being trusted to go into the store by yourself and picking up some things for the family.
Cook dinner.
That's a great one. It gives you a sense of power, efficacy. I can do things in the world. These kids don't think they matter because we've told them they're so unique. They're so separable from everybody else. They don't know they're part of a community. They're part of a world, and they need to contribute to it.
Abigail, I'd imagine people who are listening are probably saying to themselves, okay, that's fine. Marissa and Abigail, you both have families, you have husbands, you have grandparents, but there are millions of Americans who are going to school every single day who don't have a solid household, right? They don't have mom and dad in the home all the time, being able to support them mentally. That's the answer that I would get when I would push back against SEL, right? That I would say social emotional learning is a Trojan horse. Teachers are not therapists. They should not do therapy in front of 20 or 40 other kids. It is important that kids have access to good emotional learning experiences. But I would say the school is not the place to do it. And the pushback that I would get, and I imagine you're getting too, is not everybody has a healthy household to go to. And therefore we need to build a system that provides everybody with the option of emotional regulations, health and mental support, etc.
Okay, two things. First of all, what they're doing in schools, what they call emotional regulation techniques, that doesn't work for anybody. That's going to break anybody down. Telling them, let's focus on your emotions. Let's focus on your trauma. Not only is it going to break down the kid who doesn't need it, it's going to break down the kid who does. To sit with 40 other kids in their class and talk about the dad who left them. You think that's not healthy for a kid? But here's what I also want to know. The poor kids are going to suffer the most from this. Why? Because they get such low expectations. No one has high expectations for them. Okay? They need, and the solution is there. You know who does the best? Way better than, white kids in America, Latinos. They call this the immigrant paradox or the Latino paradox sometimes, right? Sometimes they call them, their mental health is better. No, regardless of socioeconomic level. Why? Because they know they're connected to a community. They know mom's counting on them to help out. They're impressed to do chores, all stuff that's great for kids. And their mom doesn't put a therapist in charge. So the idea that this is just, some sort of, we have to rush in and help the poor kids. Let me tell you something. We've done so much damage to these kids by breaking them down and telling them they're traumatized. It's not true for most of them. And it's not helpful anyway.
When you went into doing this research on this very important book, you said that you didn't realize what you're going to find, right? You said that the thesis had to change. You possibly had to talk to I guess the company that you signed with and change things.
Yeah.
What did you find out that really surprised you, that made you realize that you were onto something different than what you originally thought?
So I realized two things. One, that these kids were flooded with therapy. That's why they were never saying they were shy. They were saying, I have social phobia. You never hear the word depressed. It was sad. You only hear, I'm depressed. You never hear the word worried anymore. They never say they're worried. I have anxiety. They were all speaking the language of psychopathology. So they were getting flooded with therapy, and a lot of it was coming from schools and with their parents. Tell me about your feelings. Let's talk about your feelings. Endlessly soliciting their feelings.
One of the things you write about in your book is this incident that you had at the pediatrician. Your child had a stomachache or something, and you took them to the pediatrician, and then they moved you out of the room and started asking your child whether they have suicidal thoughts or something like that.
That's right. So these kids are getting so many mental health surveys. These are not innocuous. These are profound interventions. They are bringing up suicide all the time with these kids. My son, I took him to an urgent care clinic because he had a stomach ache that, when he got back from summer camp. And after deciding it was just dehydration, I got up to go and they said, oh, hold on, we're going to ask you to leave the room because we have to do our mental health survey. And I got up to leave. And then thought, wait a second, I just wrote a whole book about this. Excuse me, can I please see your survey? And I took a picture of it. It was put out by the National Institute of Mental Health. This is their standard protocol now for kids aged 8 and up. And it asked kids 5 escalating questions about whether they might want to kill themselves. Now, here's the problem. Not only is this terrible for a kid who wasn't considering suicide, who might alone in that room answer yes, and then you can't take him home. They tell you he's suicidal. Now we need to watch him, right? But there's something else too. What about the kid who has suicidal thoughts? The first thing the National Institute of Mental Health thought to do was separate him from his parents.
Wow. I mean, I think it's just the way you phrase it makes it so alarming, right? I think people just don't think about it. We have been conditioned to do this group think and not think at all, that when you just put the obvious in front of us, it's just mind-boggling. You and I were at a talk a few days ago, and you mentioned the story, and there was a pediatrician that walked up to us and said, I don't take the $15. And I said, what $15? What are you talking about? And the pediatrician responded and said, we are offered to receive $15 essentially from the government for every survey that a child completes or a parent allows a child to complete. I mean, the incentive to separate the parents from the entire experience and to have the pediatricians and the schools all be involved in this bizarre breakdown of the family is really, it's actually very scary. It's personally very scary to me because I want to be able to trust the society that I live in. And so many of these things are just becoming glaring examples of how important it is that we step back in.
Well, the book is entirely looks at the research of, I went through this from a psychological perspective because parents were getting so pushed around. Every time parents thought, this doesn't seem right. Why are they asking my kids about suicide? And people said, well, it's for mental health. These are coping techniques and your child could be suicidal. Parents didn't have a response.
Or the gaslighting is real.
Right, the gaslighting is real. So I went back and looked at the research to see, well, is this actually good for kids? And the truth is, repetitively bringing up suicide with kids, valorizing the person who killed themselves, do you know anyone, this sort of thing, those things, that is exactly how to spread a suicide contagion.
Well, that's also what they did with the gender affirming care, right? Your first book. Are you sure you don't want to be a boy? Right. Are you sure you don't want to be? Maybe you want to be a boy. Maybe do you want to try? Maybe dress up like a boy? Maybe, right? And so eventually you put it in the child's mind enough times, they start questioning. And when you actually reward them for, oh, so wonderful that you're now deciding to change your gender. Let's all celebrate. It's so wonderful that you're going to a therapist on a regular basis because you're taking care of yourself. Oh, parent, you're a great parent for taking your child to therapy 3 times a week. So you're actually celebrating the act of victimhood.
That's right. And I interviewed a young woman, 16-year-old in the book. I call her Nora. But basically, she told me, and many, many high school students then, said the same thing. She told me that in high school, it's really weird if you don't have a mental health diagnosis.
Wow.
And the problem is, look, you can say I was shy or I was lazy, and you can get over those things. But once you start saying, no, I have anxiety, you're talking yourself into a brain problem. Well, how do you solve a brain problem? You need an expert to help you and you need a drug.
If Abigail from her 20s could make it into 2024 and watch you do the work that you're doing today, what do you think young Abigail, not that you're not young anymore, but what do you think young Abigail would say about the work you're doing today?
It's funny. I've always kind of been a truth teller, and it's certainly gotten me into a lot of trouble socially. I mean, I was always the one that girls would say to me in high school, you can't say that, but here's sort of what I've learned. And that is that there was this amazing role for me by telling the truth, because we're living in this time where the pressures to go along are so extreme that there was a role for the way I was. And the reason I bring that up, I guess the psychological profession, they call it disagreeable personality is the category. I'm willing to sort of hurt people's feelings to say the truth. But here's the thing that I want people to know. We're all different. And just because your child is a little quirky in this way or that, it doesn't mean they have a mental disorder. Don't let someone diagnose them unless they absolutely have a problem. Because if they don't have a problem, you're going to change the way that child sees himself. And if you start a child on medication, you may be putting them in an emotional snowsuit. They may not feel the lows anymore, but they might not get the highs either. You want to develop their musculature. Stop asking all the time, how do I make my kids happy? Start asking, how do I make my kids strong? If we make strong kids, they'll be happy kids.
I completely agree. So much of what we're falling into is the language game, the expert word game, where we're manipulated to think that things that are really bad for us, they say are good for us. We talked a little bit about SEL, and there are many other words like that. And I want to empower the people who are listening to us to understand how to navigate some of the terminology that is being thrown our way. You know, there's both good terminology and bad terminology. I wrote some of it down. I just think it's so important that we just offer as much help as we can. And I know that's the goal that you have as well. That was PragerU. The whole point of this organization is to empower people. So let's play a little word game where maybe you can help clarify to those who are listening some of the things that I have collected as words that will show up in family everyday life. Let's start with SEL. SEL. How should people think about SEL?
Social emotional learning. It's a program in school. It means anything they want, the educators want it to mean. Sometimes it means straight up Marxism, but very often it's a psychological program that is essentially group therapy, getting kids to dwell on their pain.
And oftentimes takes the time of reading, writing, and arithmetic, right?
Does that too.
It's something you can't measure. I'd add that. Use the term memory poker.
Yeah, so I got that from Elizabeth Loftus, a wonderful, brilliant psychologist and one of the greatest living psychologists of the 20th century. And she said that when you put people in a group therapy setting, you often have this sort of memory poker. Everyone tries to one-up each other with their trauma, and that's why it leads people to feel sadder very often. And that's what we're doing in schools. We're asking, and what was a hard thing you've gone through? Well, you don't want to say something boring after your friend just talked about his parents' divorce. So now you have to come up with something really traumatic. The problem is, in the process, you're likely to exaggerate a past memory, especially a child, and you're also likely to talk yourself into the idea that you've been traumatized.
Parentified. The term parentified.
This is more of the psychopathologization of human life. They take something positive, giving kids high expectations and responsibility, and they tell them, no, you've been emotionally abused by your parents.
Can you give any examples of how you came across this term?
Sure. Immigrant kids are told you were parentified. Your parents, sometimes they'll outright say it, but it's a form of abuse. Why? Your parents put too much responsibility on you. You know what? Immigrant kids do great for a reason, because they have that responsibility, because their parents exert authority and they have responsibility, and it serves them well.
So like a family that immigrated here and the parents don't speak English very well. And I could think of those examples where the child has to help the parents get through filling up forms and helping them get through life in general. But because the child doesn't get to be child for the rest of their lives, they've been parentified.
Right,
Is that the concept?
Exactly. And you know what? Giving to the common good, doing for the common good is so good for your mental health.
Oh my, it's so enriching.
It's so enriching. But instead, you've got these kids who are running towards adulthood. These immigrant kids are running towards adulthood. And you have these native-born American kids who want to stay on their parents' couch and live at home when they're 18 to 25. We've never had so many American kids choosing to live with mom and dad.
Oh, wow. What a glaring example. You talk about the term trauma, and I guess I learned, this is a newer thing for me, because when I was an educator, I didn't hear the word trauma come up so often. So I think that has been a very negative evolution of probably SEL. But how should we think about this term trauma in conjunction with our kids going to school?
Sure. So like everything else, there are traumatic events. There are people with PTSD. The problem is that we've convinced everyone that every bit of hardship, every bit of heartbreak is trauma, and they might have PTSD. It's a very bad suggestion for kids. It's not true. It's actually nonsense. Most of them will do just fine. And it gets applied to every hard thing a kid goes through. They will say, oh, your grandmother died. That was trauma. In most cases, that won't be. As sad as it is, the child will recover fine. We want, obviously, grandkids to outlive their grandparents.
I'm going to make a conscious decision to not use the word trauma and PTSD because it's become part of our lexicon.
Right.
I was like, oh my God, I had such a traumatizing day.
Right.
And we need to be so careful with the words we use because we then rob them of their true meaning.
And here's the thing. It's not that I don't respect people who have real PTSD, who have gone through severe traumatic experience. It doesn't help them that we're applying it casually to a population that didn't go through anything particularly scary.
When you think about the term experts, because I feel like that's a term that's logged at us oftentimes in order to manipulate us into making certain decisions, how do you think about experts?
Yeah, so obviously, like a lot of Americans, I think we all sort of lost a lot of faith we had in experts. But they're always, it's this giant shell game going on. Oh, you have to master the new methods for child rearing. Now you have to deal with this parenting expert or this psychological expert. Let me tell you something. Let's start with parenting experts. To me, the only parenting expert, the only person you should listen to for advice is someone who has raised good kids to adulthood. That is a person worth consulting. Not this person who mastered this awkward set of techniques for talking to a kid where you never get to meet the kids that her wonderful techniques have produced.
You know what's amazing? I think about the books that have been written by parenting experts and how many of them don't even have children.
Right.
It's pretty glaring. Right? Just go take those parenting expert books and just put them away and use your parental instincts because you love your kids.
And your history and experience. What did your mom do? I mean, here's the thing. They not only did they ruin parents' confidence, but they made them awkward and weird with their children by professionalizing it. Parents talk to children now like they're imitating therapists. Everyone sounds like oh, are you having big feelings? I mean, everyone is aping this therapeutic language. I can see that made you really sad not to get the red cup instead of the blue cup. And we've lost the fun of being with our kids. And you know what? It was never supposed to be a professional relationship. You needed authority. You needed a certain amount of hierarchy, but it was yours. These are your kids. Raise them according to your values as you think is best.
I think parents want to receive some sort of manual so that they can get a guarantee that they're going to ace that test because that's what our mindset has been on, right? We're on this assembly line where we go through the washer, which is what I call basically our left-wing indoctrination centers, also known as government schools. And we have to go through a rigorous assembly line of how to win in life, right? How to win in finding the careers that we should be getting or even raising kids. And so we have to have the experts to give us a manual. And if we read the manual and we follow the manual, then we'll be successful at that. And forget about our instincts, forget about our autonomy. Let's just make sure that we follow the experts so that we can be guaranteed to be successful. And you know what? Many of us are going to raise great kids because we're great people. And some great people are going to raise not great kids. And some not great people will raise great kids. Not everything can be controlled or really decided upon by some sort of manual that has been written by a supposed expert. And I think that's why we're being duped because we are expected to follow some sort of assembly line process in order to win in life.
And we're not following what we know works. I mean, actually passing on your values to your kids, that's essential. Parents have thought since the beginning of truly going back, I don't know how many thousands of years, they thought that passing on our values to our kids is an essential part of parenting. Raising a strong person, giving them independence, teaching them something and giving them the independence, which means not monitoring them. Because you know how psychologists introduce stress into any experiment? They add monitoring. We are stressing out these kids with our frantic monitoring. We don't trust them to exercise their judgment because we never lay down the rules with them. We try to avoid punishment, so we can't trust their judgment, and then we have to hover endlessly. And that's what we're doing.
The term caregivers comes to my mind because I know that is a term that the schools have been using a lot instead of parents.
Right. I mean, it's an offensive term. It really is. It reduces parents to service providers, but it's also an instructive term. When I saw it in the materials in the schools, I thought, this is how the teachers think of, or the educators think of parents, and it's teaching children. This is what your parents are. They're just service providers for you. They're not particularly important. And we can sit around discussing what they did last night, what your punishment was, or how they behaved with you, and decide if we think it's good.
Wow. What's your reaction to the term equity?
I think it's just Marxism by another name, right? It's an idea of redistribution.
It's a big part of the new SEL curriculum across America. People think that the problems are only in California and New York, but I've been scanning through curriculum all over the country. It is a fundamental piece of SEL. There are so many books that are coming out that even talk about how to teach SEL through the lens of equity.
Yeah.
And I just would imagine that for a big segment of the population, that which you identify as a problem, which is you are a victim, the system is set up to basically hurt you and stifle you. That is what we're teaching through equity and SEL. Have you noticed that also through your research?
Absolutely. They call it transformative SEL. That's the explicitly Marxist SEL. But, the reason I didn't write about that part was because I thought, and I still think that's something that parents are generally aware of. They know to look for the critical race theory. Chris Rufo and others have done wonderful work to expose that. What they might not know is that the stuff that travels under the rubric mental health, that's just as harmful.
It is so important what you just said, because what has happened is we are laser focused on the words that we already know are dangerous, and they've already moved on to doing much bigger things. And they're just out there laughing at us. Yeah. You go focus, marinate over equity. Meanwhile, we're going to take the whole mental health industry and dominate it.
Exactly. Sometimes I think they almost stuck in some of that transformative, the critical race theory, almost to confuse people, because the truth is, even the stuff that's supposedly supposed to teach emotional regulation, that's doing a fair amount of harm too.
Wow. Could you just talk a little bit about student mental health surveys and student mental health clinics? I know that they're opening some of these mental health clinics in schools.
Absolutely. Across California, certainly in the Los Angeles area. And I believe across California, we now have these mental health clinics. I mean, the mandate now in schools across the country is increase mental health. They did these amazing studies, 2 sets of studies while I was writing the book, in Australia and in England. Actually, a set of researchers studied whether these techniques, these so-called mental health techniques, were good for kids, like wellness, emotional regulation techniques, coping techniques. Were they helping kids? And what they found again and again was that the kids who went through those programs ended up sadder and more anxious and more alienated from their parents. So the stuff that travels under mental health is not helping. It really is injurious.
Abigail, final question. For those who are listening, I'm sure they have steam coming out of their ears. They're probably very upset about a lot of the stuff. And there are a lot of other things that are very upsetting about what's happening in America right now. But in order for us not to get overwhelmed and also realize that we can do something, what are the first steps that you recommend that we do in order to get out of this mess?
Right. So
give me easy stuff. Don't say, elect a new, shut down the Department of Education. Something we can actually do ourselves.
Okay. What I want you to know is this is the easiest problem to fix.
Good. I want easy.
This is the easiest problem. Like, we in America have been raising good kids to adulthood for generations. We know how to do this. It requires parental authority, which doesn't mean being unloving. It means being loving. But ultimately, parents make the rules, and parents, mete out consequences, if there are consequences, which means saying no. Okay, we know this is good for kids. It means give them people who love them and they love back over a lifetime. That's so important. Cousins, uncles, aunts, grandma, grandpa, those people are essential. Tell them they're connected to a broader world and make sure they know they have to contribute to it. That means things like chores, doing something, giving them a sense of efficacy in this world. You can walk home from school. You can walk home from the school bus. I can trust you to do that. Look both ways and go ahead. Trusting them to develop their natural resources, but it also means when they're hurt, when they're sad, when someone says something mean to them, tells them, you know what, you're going to be just fine. Keep playing.
I love it. I'm going to have my kids cook dinner tonight.
Good.
And I'm going to add a little sprinkle of vitamin N. Vitamin No. How about that?
I love it.
Thanks for this great work that you do and this great discussion. Really appreciate you.
Oh, it's always great talking to you, Marissa. Thank you.